We have a fantastic program, many distinguished speakers from across the academic world. I'm not going to steal any of their time. I'm just going to hand over to the person who's actually been pulling all of this together and made all of this possible here today. And the person I'm talking about is Anders Olofsgård, who's the academic director at SCI. So let's join a warm hand of welcome to all of you and to Anders up to the stage.
I wish you all very welcome to this second installment of what we here at SCI hope to be a yearly academic conference on sort of timely topics within applied economics. So last year the topic was about institutions and institutional reforms in emerging economies. This year the topic is about income inequality. And inequality, of course, is a timely topic. I mean, following the incredible amount of attention given in media and so on to the book by Thomas Piketty, all of a sudden people not only in the academia but also around dinner tables and in the media and so on are very much discussing this topic. Of course, in the academic debate, this is not a new topic. It's been around, it's been important for a long time. And we do have among us today and part of the program some senior contributors to this topic that have been doing sort of important contributions to our knowledge about this for a long time. So Branko is a presidential fellow at City University of New York and a senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Study Center. He was a lead economist in the World Bank Research Department from 1991 to 2013. He was the College Park Professor at the University of Maryland from 2007 to 2013 and has been a long-term visiting professor at SCI, Johns Hopkins University from 1997 to 2007. He is also the author of numerous books and articles on the methodology and empirics of global income distribution and globalization. And his most recent book, The Haves and the Have-Nots, A Brief and Idiosyncratic History of Global Inequality, that was published in December 2010, was translated into 7 different languages and selected by the Globalist as the 2011 Book of the Year. So please welcome Branko to the...
Thank SCI for the invitation and for putting this conference together. As you know, of course, the topic of inequality is a big topic these days. And it's useful to actually, we are of course people who work on inequality, have been working on inequality for a long time, are very happy that this has finally come to pass. So we are all benefiting. I will not, two small points. I will speak for, we have lots of time for my talk and the discussions. I really would not like that my talk take like 90% of the discussion. That would be distributionally unfair. So I would actually speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then I think we will open it for Q&As so that everybody will have a chance to ask a question. Secondly, it is really a talk, as you can see from the title. It is a talk about global inequality, the trends in global inequality, some methodological issues that I would only simply sort of point to, because there are really lots of methodological issues which on their own are pretty huge topics in this area. And then I would draw some possible political implications from that. And that's basically the story of the talk. So I will not speak too much about Piketty this time, because it's not, global inequality is not really an area where the work on World Top Income Database has sort of done much, but who knows, you know, that might come. Let me first define simply in one sentence. When I say global inequality, and throughout the talk, when I say global inequality, I would mean the following. Income or consumption, because depending on what type of survey data we have, inequality between individuals, all individuals in the world. Obviously, we don't have 7 billion people's incomes, but we have household surveys for most of the countries in the world, and that compilation of these 100 plus or 120 surveys approximately for each year gives you an indication of the global inequality. Obviously, there are some countries, and I have to mention that in the very beginning, which do not have the surveys, and generally speaking, these are poor countries. So global inequality numbers that I will show you today are, generally speaking, underestimates of global inequality, because the poor, some extremely poor countries like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq today are not obviously going to be represented here. Okay, so let me go over some essential things that most of you know, but it's not bad just to remind you. First, let's start with national, or what I call within national inequalities. So generally speaking, we know that they have risen in the last 20 or so years. I have here 1988 and 2008 as two dates, because that was based on quite a few other slides from this presentation, will be based on a joint paper that I did with Christoph Lackner, which created a panel of country deciles from 1988 to 2008. So that was our last year. But in some cases, I'll show you some other new results from 2011. So basically, the story is that the one that we know, that in the last 20 to 25 years, Gini's or inequality measures of any kind have risen in about 2/3 of the countries.
Factor incomes or
no, this is all the time disposable incomes at the personal level. So it's really personal income distribution. Which, by the way, also please do ask me other clarifying questions, because very often it helps just if it's a short question, not to keep it until the end. So it's really, these are the Gini's, there is no factor income distribution, it's all personal income distribution. The only big exception, which you can see on this graph, I'll simply mention it, are the countries with very, very high levels of inequality. This is the Gini 1988 on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical of a Gini 20 years later. And the big exception are the countries, so the big exception to that are really the countries with very high inequality, but which have had declines in inequality. And these countries are Brazil, for example, the most well-documented country, Mexico, Argentina, and a couple of other Latin American countries. So this is basically an exception. So if you want to see the world in terms of within national inequalities, any country that practically you pick up, including, for example, Sweden, or you take even Germany, and obviously UK, US, China, India, Russia, have all had increased inequality. So this is well known, and there is no point in sort of, flogging the dead horse. Everybody here knows that. This is the same graph, except that now here the countries are shown by their population sizes. So as you can see now, large countries, and China and India, are divided into rural and urban, because for some reasons, for China, actually they do have two separate surveys for rural and urban areas. For India, it's the same survey, but they can divide it into rural and urban, but the movements in rural and urban areas are different. So the size of the dot is population. Now, why is it important for me? Is because when I now put together all of this stuff in global inequality, surely the countries will not going to matter equally. So the countries with large population would obviously matter much more, and very often this is really large countries that have had increases in inequality. Large countries, and also technically countries with a large income, total income, would matter a lot. And then, of course, that's the US. So basically, also to give a little bit the story away, when you think of global inequality, it is really the triangular relationship between China, India, and the US, which would matter the most. In other words, if you want really to have a shortcut idea in your head, is that basically, is the US becoming relatively richer compared to the two others, or what is the relationship between the two others compared to each other in the passage of time. So that's an interesting relationship there, because it explains something like about 40 to 50% of global inequality. But the interesting part is, as China, for example, becomes richer, its own distance with the United States becomes smaller. So that pushes global inequality, as you will see in a minute, down. But as China becomes richer, and let's suppose India, and it's the case, is not catching up with China, that creates a distance between China and India and puts an upward pressure on global inequality. So we are not really that far from the time that if China continues growing at this rate, it is obviously, you will see, really the key factor in reducing global inequality. But the time could come that China becomes a disequalizing force. So things, change. So these are some of the issues which I will not read, which are raised with these within national inequalities. I have not, I have not put here a number of other issues raised by Piketty's book. I could have done that as well. Actually, the slides might have been done before the book was done. But these are the issues that appear, sort of emerge from the work on global inequality. And of course, the big one is this hollowing out of the middle classes, on which I would have to say something more. And the last point here I would like to point out, this is currently something that I'm working with several co-authors, is this issue of the hidden wealth of the rich. Now, there is no wealth information here in what I'm going to present, but if we get data about the hidden wealth of the rich, and we have some estimates, then we can of course impute or expect to hope to impute actual income flows from these hidden wealth assets, or these hidden assets rather. And then we will be able to impute that most likely to the top 1% for each country, which I think would give us a better idea. Notice one thing that maybe I should mention right now is that this is all based on household survey data, the things that I'll show you. And the household survey data, after the work by Thomas Piketty and Tony Atkinson and others, we have now, I think, reasonably well convinced does not do a very good job on the top 1%. So then the idea is really how can we somehow get that information and use it in household surveys. Now let me give you just sort of as extra some data from household surveys set in a long-run Kuznets framework, or something that's very similar to what you have seen in the work by Piketty and Saez. This is actually based on household surveys in the United States. As you can see, that slide is practically the same as the slide that you get using fiscal data from Piketty. So essentially, in the case of the United States, the fiscal data, which focus on the top 1% and of course at the top of the distribution, and the data from household surveys, which focus on the entire, of course, distribution, give you basically the same story of a U-shaped curve, although as you can see here, it is really at the very top now, is still slightly below the 1929 level, but the shape is the same. And one thing that I would like also to show you is something that I showed to my students, is that we call it Kuznets and Piketty frames. Our usual frame was a Kuznets frame, and I've done quite a lot of work within that frame. The idea being, this is like long-term Gini coefficients for the UK and the US. This is, again, the two countries for which we have the longest term data with household surveys and social tables. Actually, some early data that you can see from 1688 and so on is based on social tables. And the Kuznets frame was like this. Inverted U-curve really made lots of sense, and we were generally, despite all the problems that Kuznets had from the beginning, it is still the workhorse of inequality economics. Now, this is the red one, is what I call the Piketty frame. As you can see, it's the same data, underlying data, but your approach and the way that you cut this data or slice this data is a little bit different. If you slice it with a Kuznets frame, you really have to leave out the last 20 years because it doesn't fit into that. If you slice it with the Piketty frame, with the red one, then you have a U-shaped curve with all the explanations from the book that you know, and that explanation, of course, is different from the standard explanation that we had with the Kuznets approach. And I would just simply say, this is, last graph from this within national inequalities. I personally am not, I'm of course a big fan of Piketty's book, as many of you might know. And I think it's actually a watershed book in economics, not only in inequality economics, but generally. But, I'm not ready entirely to dismiss the Kuznets approach. I believe that we might have been witnessing waves. So I'm actually thinking of Kuznets waves. So not only one curve, but actually there could be industrial revolution or something else which produces Kuznets waves. And if you look at the results for Brazil, which is here on the left, and even possibly for China, depending on how inequality proceeds in the next 10 years, you can actually see some kind of a Kuznetsevian motion there. So it may be too early to just say it is over. Kuznets is a pretty resilient guy. Many people thought that he would be over, but he's been around for now 55, 70 years. Now, the second part, the second component of the global inequality is between national inequality. So these are really gaps between nations. Whereas the first part is really inequality within each individual nation, in the second part, we deal with gaps between nations, like Spain versus Morocco, US versus Mexico, all the countries together, 100 and plus, and then technically speaking, you simply do the means of those countries' incomes against each other, weighted by population, and you get the second component of global inequality. So how did the means look like over the same period of 20 years, or today, between the countries? Now, this is based on GDP per capita because it is kind of easier to produce on an annual basis, because the household surveys that I have are generally benchmarked once every 5 years. So this is the most recent 2013 data, which use 2011 PPPs. I will come to the issue of PPPs in a minute, just sort of bear with me, just say these are the most recent PPPs, that's enough. And this is how the world looks if you say what is the average income of the countries where people live. And I'm not going to interpret that, but you can read it there. There is still this emptiness in the middle, as you can see, but this emptiness in the middle is becoming a little bit less. In other words, it's getting fuller, and obviously with the distribution of actual income, it will become even fuller, because, for example, China, Brazil, Mexico, Russia will have people who will go all the way to $40,000, $50,000 or more. So, but there is still, this kind of emptiness, which has led a little bit to the literature of the Twin Peaks and the Inequality, 20 years ago. But these Twin Peaks are, I think, in a movement of disappearance because of the rise of Asia. Now, another way to look at that is one graph that I like very much, and let me just take that. And that graph is the following. This is based on household survey data. You take incomes of people in any given country, show it on the horizontal axis, from the poorest people to the richest people, from the first percentile, which is the poorest, to the 100th. And on the vertical axis, you find their position in the global income distribution. So let's suppose I take your income, I calculate it, I use PPP, I adjust for price levels, and then I end up that you have such and such income, and you are, let's suppose, in the 80th percentile of the Swedish income distribution. And I ask you, where do you think you would be in the global income distribution? Maybe you're a modest person, you say, well, maybe I'm like in the 83rd percentile, because I'm in the 80th percentile of Sweden, but Sweden is a rich country and so on. Well, very likely you're going to be something in like 98th percentile of the global income distribution. So that's basically the idea. And then here, I do it for the United States first. And as you can see, actually US, even the very bottom percentile, actually it is the second percentile, because the first percentile often has zeros, so really it could be the people who have lost, who have had losses on self-employment income and so on. But basically, even the poorest people in the United States are above the world median. And if I have here, and I'll have it in a minute, West European countries, particularly Nordic countries, that very beginning would be even higher. So actually it would start at 70th percentile and so on. And then obviously at the very top, these people are in the top global percentile. And just for your information, 12% of Americans are in the global top 1%. And in Europe, Western Europe, rich Europe, that percentage is between 6 and 8% in UK, Germany, and so on. Then you take another extreme in a big country, I take India. So it's not surprising that, of course, people who are poor in India are also very, very poor worldwide. What is maybe a little bit unexpected is that actually even the top 1% in India, which is, mind you, 12 million people, so it's lots of people, their average income puts them only at the 83rd or 85th percentile in the world. Now, that could be a little bit of an underestimation of the top in India. But remember, this is 12 million people with average income. It's the size of Bombay. So if I wanted to go into what somebody called millésimes, like 1/10 or 1% people, so there will be 1.5 million richest Indians, or even smaller numbers, surely I would get actually to the very, very top. But we are talking about the likelihood percentage likelihood of Indians being in the top 1%, and clearly whatever you do, and it could be, as I said, that the Indian data underestimate the top, you are not going to find 10% of Indians in the very top. You can find probably maybe 2/10 or 1% or something like that. So then you will go very quickly. This is China. This is China 2008, but China changes very rapidly, so it moves, particularly the top moves up, and now currently the top is at the 90+ percentile. If I had urban China, that would be even more dramatic, because then they're actually represented in the global top 1% as well. Notice, however, extreme poverty in China at the very bottom of the income distribution. So these are also people who are among the poorest in the world. The next country is Russia. Nothing very spectacular here, except that the bottom is relatively, compared to China and India, is relatively high, which is not surprising. And of course there is a top 1%, which also is not surprising. Brazil is quite interesting, because Brazil obviously spans the world, and in some extent Brazil mimics the world, because this graph for the world, as you can sort of figure out, would actually be a 45-degree line going from the bottom to the top, and Brazil comes close to that. And as you can see, there is a sizable middle class, people who are around 80th and even 90th percentile, and then there is also the global top 1%. So that's how the world, basically, with large countries looks like. And as you can see, the gaps now, of which we speak generally, are not only shown here as gaps between mean incomes of the nations, they are shown really as gaps between individuals. And that same graph would already give you an intuition that global inequality, of course, has to be very high. If you translate this into the comparison between countries like, for example, Denmark and some poor African countries, you practically have no overlap of income distribution. So this is, I think, a very striking fact, that if you take really very, very rich countries with relatively narrow distribution of income, and you take some very poor countries with whatever minimum, could be medium income distribution or even high income distribution, but such that you don't have high percentage of people who are rich, because certainly there are individuals in those poor countries who are rich, but not in statistically significant numbers, you really get practically no overlap of the two distributions. It has some implications which are obvious for transfers or aid. I will not speak about that, but clearly if you have that situation, you're unlikely statistically to have a regressive transfer, unless you defend the idea that actually the richest guy in such and such country has stolen all the money. This is simply a graph that will show you what percentage of population in different countries is part of the global 10%. As you can see here, something like 70% of Americans and Germans and French are part of the global top 10%. As I said before, 12% of Americans are part of the global 1%. Now, we move to global inequality. Now, global inequality is the product of what we have seen as within inequality plus between. When I say product, I don't mean it's an arithmetic product, but it's a result of basically combining the two, and it can technically be also decomposed into these two components. And the question that we start first, how high it is and how has it changed over the last 25 years, because the change is an important thing, but the level is also important. So these are the three questions that you basically ask yourself if you want to have an intuition how global inequality has changed. In other words, is there convergence or divergence of countries' incomes, unweighted, just simply convergence, divergence as we normally do it? Is there a catching up, therefore, is there a catching up within poor countries? Are inequalities within nations going up? And what's happening with this triangle that I mentioned before, in particular what's happening with China and India? So I will go quickly through this graph. This is like one of my key graphs, which I call the mother of all inequality disputes, but I will go relatively quickly. This graph shows you, this is based all again on the new data. And this is now, I'll show you here GDP numbers and disposable income numbers from household surveys. This is the GDP numbers, and it's basically showing you the Gini coefficient is on the vertical axis, years are on the horizontal, showing you inequality over the last, 65 years, measured simply by unweighted difference in Gini of the unweighted GDP per capita and PPP terms of the countries. Now notice just very, very quickly, here the beginning of the divergence, actually increasing divergence partly also driven by the 2 decades of really declines in Africa, South America, and or stagnation, and Eastern Europe. And then the end of divergence, this is an interesting period, around 2000 or so, divergence of unweighted GDPs stops. In other words, the poorer countries now tend to grow faster than the rich countries. So that's an interesting development. As you can see, it kind of continues. In the last couple of years it has stopped, but there is a convergence in that sense, not individuals, countries, over the last 10 years or so. Now, the next line is very important, because this is the GDP per capita again, but weighted by population. Now, nobody is going to be surprised if you think what is to see what's happening here is that basically it is really driven by, this dot should not be there, yeah. It is basically driven by China's extraordinary growth, because now big countries matter much more. And if there is a big poor country which is growing a lot, then it's going to drive inequality down. So this is a very important point. Everything that I would say about the decline of global inequality between individuals would be to a very large extent driven by the rise of China. And underlying this rise of China is the rise of the median or mean income of China, which then obviously spreads unevenly across the population and pushes global inequality down. And that's shown in this blue line. As I put this last number, the Gini of that blue line is now 52. Now, obviously, the global Gini has to be higher because you have to include now within national inequality. And this global Gini is given by these dots, which are calculated at something like 3 to 5 year intervals. And the reason why I'm not calculated every year, because I don't have household surveys from all the countries every year. And as you can see, they are on the downward slide now, from about 2000 approximately. So if you want to be very optimistic, you have then the following movements in the last 15 years. You have continuation of very high rates of growth of populous poor countries, which is shown in the blue line and which pushes global inequality down. You have basically an end to increased within national inequalities. They are not rising that much anymore. And third, you have the beginning of convergence between country incomes, shown by the red line, which also went down. So these are very hopeful developments from global inequality. I will come in a minute what are the negative developments. But these are, if you want to focus on the positive, these are 3 big positive developments. Furthermore, what has happened? This is what I called concept 3 inequality. This is the global inequality. Furthermore, and I want to just very briefly mention that, what has happened with the new PPP numbers has added yet an additional, how should I say, dampening factor to global inequality at the level stage, no longer the change. Because what happened with the new GDP, with the new PPP numbers, which, as you know, measure the price levels in all the countries, it turned out now that China and India have actually lower price level than they were assigned or estimated in 2005. And not only them, many countries, actually, they are here, I'm actually representing them against the previous PPP numbers. And what it does, it makes poorer countries richer with respect to the rich countries where the PPP changes were almost zero. So that means that the global inequality and global poverty go down. So there is yet another, you might say, sort of a purely accounting, but it's a real, if we believe in these new numbers, it's a real factor showing that the price levels in China and India are lower. Consequently, the incomes in local currency that we use for household surveys are actually made higher in PPP, international dollar terms. And just to give you an idea of the revisions in some cases are really stunning. Like Indonesia's income goes up almost by double, by 90%. As you can see, China 17%, India 26%, and so forth. And then I put it also by different regions. And you can see then population weighted or just simply all the countries unweighted. But you see basically Africa and Asia get a boost of about 1/3 of their income. Eastern Europe 24%, Latin America 70%, and the rich world 2%. So essentially what has happened is that there was a re-evaluation of income levels, and the revaluation came up with higher numbers for the poor countries. Now we have not yet, I have not yet included all of that. There are many reasons, including the fact the World Bank, when it comes to the use of the new PPP numbers for poverty calculation, has been sitting on the fence, has not yet incorporated it. And I think I should go together with them because basically global inequality and global poverty go together. Partly I didn't have the time, or maybe I was lazy to recalculate everything now with these new PPPs. It's not a difficult issue, but it does require some work. I will actually have to change all my numbers, which I already did once when the 2005 PPPs came out. But what is dramatic here is that that blue line, which I already have shown you, now with the population-weighted GDPs, now becomes even more dramatically declining. So you see this number 47, and it was 52 in the other case. We are basically now getting a decline of global inequality on the account of this change of between 3 to 4 Gini points. So whatever was the global inequality until yesterday will now become global inequality lower by 3 to 4 Gini points on the account of the new PPP. This is a substantial change. Mind you, it is a change in the level, the change in the shape, and the trend is going to remain more or less the same. It will change slightly, actually I know that, but the level is going to go down. And now I will show you the level. Simply give you first the population coverage of household surveys. This is all disposable income now or consumption. And as you can see, normally it's about 93–94%. My 2011 data are not finished yet. I'm actually sort of not releasing them yet because it is not full. As you can see, I have large missing gaps still with Africa, and the total population is only 83% of the world. But generally speaking, it's more than 90%, and with a caveat that I mentioned before of poor countries not being included. Now, how does this global inequality look like? I put here the global inequality turns out to be a Gini of 70. This is the very, very top, where it's called the world. And then I put it against different countries, and I put it against the average income. So in other words, when you look at China, you see China's increase in inequality plotted against the mean income, actually GDP per capita of China in this particular case. And the same thing for the United States. You see this inexorable increase over the last 30 years. Russia is interesting because that weird movement is the result of the increase in inequality happening simultaneously with the fall of income. So that's why it goes kind of backwards. Brazil, as you can see also, Brazil with very, very high inequality, but with a declining inequality. The green dots are on the decline. And obviously you can see that the world inequality is first higher than inequality in any individual country, which is not surprising, but also you can see how the world income has also increased over that period, and currently the world income is there at the level of Brazil, maybe slightly below Russia. So that's where the average income of the world is. Now, the second point, this is about the levels. The second point is how has the world changed between the two years that I mentioned before, 1988 and 2008. And this is an important slide. That slide shows you on the horizontal axis the position from the first poorest percentile in the world to the 100th percentile. And on the vertical axis, it shows you the real income gain over these 20 years, 1988 to 2008. So, this is based on the panel data that I mentioned before, where each country is represented by its country decile. So we are no longer talking about, obviously, like this country did well, that country did poorly. We're talking about individual country deciles. So, for example, the third decile of China might have done very, very well, but the 10th decile of China, actually we have China as urban and rural, might have done even much better. You know, it could be that actually in this case, in Turkey, the middle has done well. So the 5th and 6th decile in Turkey have done well, but you know, the 10th decile has not done as well. So it gives you much greater sort of flexibility and information. So what the basic story is, and I think it's an important one, is that you actually get a situation where around the median, broadly around the median of the global income distribution, you have had a very large increase in relative terms. We are talking about the increase of about 80% real over these 20 years. And you have significant increases among the poor people. And then notice that group over there with no, so this is what I call, just to give you an idea, China's middle class. It's not only China, it's also India, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on. But let's just, for the sake of the argument, say it's China's middle class, which is relatively poor by West European standards, because as you can see, these are people who are like about $4.50 or $5 per day, which would be below the poverty line, significantly below the poverty line in the rich countries. But then the interesting part is that group over here, that for the sake of the convenience I will call US lower middle class. And that story really remains. I will show you several ways to replay this data, but that essential story replays, and it's one of the key, I think, issues, is that you have had over the 20 or 25 years, let me go back. Oh, yeah, this is wrong. You have had this story of lack of growth among the lower middle classes, or the lower part of the income distribution of the rich world. And just to give you 3 big countries with such sort of situation, is the US, Germany, and Japan. People forget, but Germany really and its sort of lower part of the distribution had almost very little growth over these 20 years. Japan negative even. US positive, but small. And then, of course, nothing comparable to what happened in the middle of the income distribution among the relatively poor, quote-unquote, middle classes of the Asian countries. And then you have continuation of very high rate of growth, as you can see, 70% or so, among the top 1%. Now, this particular shape, which I call the supine S, remains in any other sort of way that you want to present the data, and I'll show you that very quickly. I show it here with the world and without China, so you can see how much, first, that the shape remains more or less even without China. Secondly, that the importance of China is enormous, because the gap between the blue line and the red line is obviously explained by China. I can show it very quickly, even if you do something else, which we call it actually quasi-non-anonymous growth incidence curve, which means you keep the country deciles, which were poor in 1988, and calculate what was their rate of growth. So in this case, you really keep as it were, these are not real same people, but country deciles in 1988, and plot against them what was the average rate of growth among these deciles. This is very heterogeneous deciles, because people who were like in the bottom, let's suppose, 5th percentile in the world in 1988 could be, first decile, the poorest decile in Botswana, the 3rd decile in Congo, the 4th decile in Burma. So they're all these heterogeneous poor people, and then you look how well they have done. Notice the curve, even in that case, displays the same supine S pattern. So that's an important, I think, finding. This is with percentiles. So again, it remains the same, even you have some global percentiles here that are actually negative, with negative growth. There are very few, but some exist, because basically everybody else is a positive. So this key issue is, what is suggested by that, is, technically speaking, if you take a snapshot, it's a fact that something which may be called global or Asian middle class has risen and has actually had large increases in real incomes. It is also true that very many lower middle class people in rich countries have had very small growth over these 25 years. The question is, are these two phenomena related? I cannot prove that. I don't know how to prove it with the data that I have. and I leave this aside. There could be that it's not driven by globalization. It could be that it's driven by technological change. It could be driven also by changing norms, by institutional framework or whatever. But whatever you believe, I don't think that the link between that development and globalization could be totally excluded, and it has, I believe, to provide at least part of the explanation. And even if it provides very little of the explanation, which I don't believe, in the minds of people, the two are going to be linked. And that leads us to the political issue that, if I want to put it bluntly, that the stagnation of the middle class in the rich countries may be related to the growth of incomes of the middle classes in Asia. Now, if you really are cosmopolitan in nature, the two developments are, that development is not a bad thing, because poorer people are getting richer, whereas already pretty rich people, globally speaking, are just staying where they were before. So if you were within the same country, that would not be something which you would be very unhappy with necessarily. However, the world is not one country. So, politically speaking, I think it raises, and that's why I had this political word in my presentation, it raises a political issue, because obviously these people who have not seen growth are not going to be happy, and they work within the political framework of their own countries. So the question that one can ask that is, if the current wave of globalization and what we have seen of this supineness is just the first wave of another 3 or 4 waves, because mind you, the world is extremely unequal, and there are many, many more poor, large countries coming behind China. China is already now moving towards the middle. So if there are new waves, and if you want to be very pessimistic and say, well, let's suppose that we have 50 years of absence of growth among relatively poor people in rich countries, so that maybe at some point the two distributions in the middle sort of converge. The Western stays the same, and then, India, Nigeria, and Indonesia start increasing and eventually converge. How would that play for the future of democracy in the next 50 years in the rich countries? I'm less concerned in that sense for democracy in poorer countries, because if you are optimistic, you can say the rise of the middle class would also drive democratic developments there. But the question is actually, how would it play in rich countries? And I will not have time to speak about that because I'm at the end of my time now, but I can see obviously two possibilities, none of which is necessarily great. One, which we already see, is plutocracy, which basically I think would be good for globalization, because plutocracies in individual rich countries would maintain globalization, since it is generally in their interest, and they have a sort of, I would say, using Marxist terminology, a class alliance between the rich people in rich countries and poor people in poor countries. They might even be in favor of migration, a topic which I will not talk today much, but it is still in the slides, so if you take the slides you will find it. Or the other possibility, which also we see in Europe, the first one I think US is a much more emblematic, plutocracy. The second one is populism, where actually the resentment against globalization can be turned into a resentment against immigrants, or in that case, we will see a backsliding. It's very hard to do backsliding in globalization, but it's not impossible, but that could be another reaction. So neither of these two, I think, are necessarily good reactions, but if you believe these numbers, and if you believe causality, and if you believe something which I sort of made up right now, then you might actually see that it's not maybe totally unreasonable. Just a very last point, just to leave you with the idea that these relative changes, which were so dramatic among the median of the income distribution in the world, when translated in real absolute amounts, are much less, because the gaps between different parts of the world distribution are enormous. So if I take just the total gain in income between 1988 and 2008 and say this is 100 and apportion it by different groups, I ended up with more than half of total gain being made in the top 5%. And the reason why they're in the middle, in China now the numbers are small, is because if they get like 4 units, these 4 units are a lot for them because they also start with 4 units. So it's like double their income. But if you're at the top of the income distribution, top 1%, if you get 4 units, it's very little for you because your income is about like 25 times higher than the income of these Chinese in the middle. So, you know, in terms of absolute gains, the absolute gains are still very heavily concentrated among the rich. Which of course leads you to the issue whether we should really look at absolute gains, relative gains. I'm not going to engage into that. There is of course a paper by Brandolini and Atkinson on that we should really look at absolute income inequality. But I'm a conservative guy. I actually look at the relative. This is just simply a slide to represent what I said before, is that if you take these 2 slices where there was largest increases in income and stagnation of income, about 90% of countries there are, in one case with these high dots, are actually, as you can see, urban China, rural China, different deciles there. You know, second decile in the urban, third decile in the rural, and so on, or actually higher deciles in both cases. And the second graph shows you, again, the dots are, the dark dots are OECD countries. You know, different lower deciles from OECD countries. 90% of the deciles which had no growth are from OECD countries. If you take out transition countries, then you still end up with 72% of the deciles from the rich countries. So basically that's what I already said before. This is a simple illustration of the Chinese catch-up, which I take the relatively low decile in the US and relatively high decile in China. And you know, of course then you see this dramatic closing of the gap between the two. And I think I'm actually going to, I should be stopping here now. And just to show finally something which was implied, what is this called emerging global middle class. And you can see the distribution now in 88 and 2008. Now, mind you, these are now actual people. So it is like the distribution of the world as if it were one country. And as you can see, there is this thickening in the middle, very significant thickening in the middle, coming from what is called the Asian middle class, which is still, of course, very poor, because even the very top of that middle, which is $16 PPP per day, is just like above the social minimum in many rich countries. So it is a middle class, it can be called the global middle class, but we should not forget that the global middle class is not the same thing as the middle class in rich countries. And I will stop with this, political issues, because I already alluded to one of them, which is the key one, is the hollowing out of the middle classes in the rich world and the relationship with the rise of Asia. And there are a few others which might come up in a discussion. Just to tell you, the citizenship rent is the fact that still most of your income is determined by where you live, and that for 97% of the people of the world, where you live is where you were born, and that raises some potential political philosophy issues, whether there should be, or there is clearly no global inequality of opportunity, but whether global inequality of opportunity should be a topic or not. And then it also leads to the issue of migration, as I said before, because large gaps in incomes obviously are an underlying force which pushes migration, and that leads us also to the issue of whether we should really include migration as part of development or not. Again, both citizenship rent and migration have pro and con arguments, even in terms of political philosophy, but what we can bring to the issue of discussion is actually the empirical data which underline both of these philosophical and political issues. So I would like to thank you again for listening to me. I hope most of you did. And then, of course, I think now we will go for Q&A.
Right. So thank you very much.
have a fantastic program, many distinguished speakers from across the academic world. I'm not going to steal any of their time. I'm just going to hand over to the person who's actually been pulling all of this together and made all of this possible here today. And the person I'm talking about is Anders Olofsgård, who's the academic director at SCI. So let's join a warm hand of welcome to all of you and to Anders up to the stage.
But I wish you all very welcome to this second installment of what we here at SCI hope to be a yearly academic conference on sort of timely topics within applied economics. So last year the topic was about institutions and institutional reforms in emerging economies. This year the topic is about income inequality. And inequality, of course, is a timely topic. I mean, following the incredible amount of attention given in media and so on to the book by Thomas Piketty, all of a sudden people not only...
Global inequality is not really an area where the work on World Top Income Database has sort of done much, but who knows, you know, that might come. Let me first define simply in one sentence. When I say global inequality, and throughout the talk, when I say global inequality, I would mean the following. Income or consumption, because depending on what type of survey data we have, inequality between individuals, all individuals in the world. Obviously, we don't have 7 billion people's incomes, but we have household surveys from most of the countries in the world, and that compilation of these 100 plus, or 120 surveys approximately, for each year gives you an indication of the global inequality. Obviously, there are some countries, and I have to mention that in the very beginning, which do not have the surveys, and generally speaking, these are poor countries. So global inequality numbers that I will show you today are generally speaking underestimates of global inequality, because the poor, some extremely poor countries like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq today are not obviously going to be represented here. Okay, so let me go over. Thank SCI for the invitation and for putting this conference together. As you know, of course, the topic of inequality is a big topic these days, and it's useful to actually, we are of course people who work on inequality, have been working on inequality for a long time. I'm very happy that this has finally come to pass. So we are all benefiting. I will not, two small points. I will speak for, we have lots of time for my talk and the discussion, so I really would not like that my talk take like 90% of the discussion. That would be distributionally unfair. So I would actually speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then I think we will open it for Q&As so that everybody will have a chance to ask a question. Secondly, it is really a talk, as you can see from the title. It is a talk about global inequality, the trends in global inequality, some methodological issues that I would only simply sort of point to, because there are really lots of methodological issues which on their own are pretty huge topics in this area. And then I would draw some possible political implications from that. And that's basically the story of the talk. So I will not speak too much about Piketty this time, because it's not...
in the academia, but also around dinner tables and in the media and so on, are very much discussing this topic. Of course, in the academic debate, this is not a new topic. It's been around, it's been important for a long time. And we do have among us today, and part of the program, some senior contributors to this topic that have been doing sort of important contributions to our knowledge about this for a long time. So Branko is a presidential fellow at City University of New York and a senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Study Center. He was a lead economist in the World Bank Research Department from 1991 to 2013. He was the College Park Professor at the University of Maryland from 2007 to 2013, and has been a long-term visiting professor at SCI, Johns Hopkins University from 1997 to 2007. He is also the author of numerous books and articles on the methodology and empirics of global income distribution and globalization. And his most recent book, The Haves and the Have-Nots, A Brief and Idiosyncratic History of Global Inequality, that was published in December 2010, was translated into 7 different languages and selected by the Globalist as the 2011 Book of the Year. So please welcome Branko to the...
Some essential things that most of you know, but it's not bad just to remind you. First, let's start with national, or what I call within national inequalities. So generally speaking, we know that they have risen in the last 20 or so years. I have here 1988 and 2008 as two dates, because that was based on quite a few other slides from this presentation, will be based on a joint paper that I did with Christoph Lackner, which created a panel of country deciles from 1988 to 2008. So that was our last year. But in some cases, I'll show you some other new results from 2011. So basically, the story is that the one that we know, that in the last 20 to 25 years, Gini's or inequality measures of any kind have risen in about 2/3 of the countries.
Factor incomes or
No, this is all the time disposable incomes at the personal level. So it's really personal income distribution. Which, by the way, also please do ask me other clarifying questions, because very often it helps just if it's a short question, not to keep it until the end. So it's really, these are the Gini's, there is no factor income distribution, it's all personal income distribution. The only big exception, which you can see on this graph, I'll simply mention it, are the countries with very, very high levels